Welcome, Anth 220, to our next lecture focusing on contemporary food systems. We've covered already the aspects of the evolution of human diet, especially early human diet, and made some analogs with extant primates. We've looked a bit into modern hunter-gatherer subsistence systems from a nutritional perspective, and also related that to early human diets. And we looked at the rise and the change to agriculture and some of the benefits and consequences of that change. Now, in our readings for this week, we look at a few more contemporary food systems. I'm not going to give you an exhaustive review of the readings, but I am going to touch on a few of the readings and highlight a few of the important points in those readings today. Specifically, we're going to take a little bit of time and explore just the tip of the iceberg for swidden agriculture and for the industrialization of meat. Again, you're going to have to do the readings, but this lecture will be a good complement to that. More than likely, most of you have heard about slash and burn or shifting or swidden agriculture. I mean, this is probably one of the earliest forms of agriculture, and it's certainly a frequently used agriculture technique. I mean, even today in the world, especially among developing countries in parts of the Americas, parts of Africa, parts of Asia. This is a subsistence system that's used by about 500 million people around the world. So what is it? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's slash and burn. You cut down the trees, you clear the brush from a plot of land, and then you plant a particular kind of crop. Now that would seem to run immediately into a problem, because I just said you need to cut down the trees and clear the brush. Well, that's not exactly the case, right? You need to clear the land. But to cut down the trees would require equipment of some sort. You would need to have chainsaws or electricity or access to some technology to fell trees. Well, another way to do that, to clear the land, is simply to burn it, right? So this is a subsistence agriculture that requires very little technology. The next steps would be to plant your crops, to cultivate, and to harvest your crops on that plot of cleared land for a particular amount of time, until the forest has regrown too much. It becomes too weedy, you get too much of the forest invading back into that plot. And then you would need to move to another plot and start the process all over again. But you don't just completely abandon the previous plot. I mean, you're still able to use that for some time to harvest the fruit that is still growing in the area, or some of the other food items before they are completely outcompeted by the natural vegetation of the forest. As you may recall from our readings, among people living in the Amazonian rainforest, there is typically one or two plots that are established every year by a family. And one or two plots by themselves are a lot, but in addition to that, you also have a plot that you planted last year, or plots, and plots that were planted the year before that, and the year before that, and so on and so forth. So now you have many different plots that are at completely different stages of growth or regrowth and production. Your newly planted plots will have immature crops. Your plots going back for several years will be producing crops, and your crops going back, or your plots going back 5 years or so, will will still have fruit trees that you planted with your crops, if you planted fruit trees, for example. A lot of people do plant fruit trees with their crops because those trees will just be reaching a productive, fertile age by the time that the plot is regenerating. And that means that you can harvest that fruit in a plot of land that you can no longer use for growing commercial crops. But also that fruit will attract other forested animals, whatever that happens to be, to the plot of land, which can then also be hunted. In any case, those older plots are beginning to be overgrown, and what you're looking at are just various stages then of forest regeneration until the forest reclaims that plot of land. And then you can start the whole process all over again. So by doing this, by burning down the forest, you can create a very fertile plot of land. And I mean quite literally, because the ash is full of nutrients, and that allows you to more easily grow your crops. It also creates a problem, because without all of those trees and the natural undergrowth or vegetation, the ground becomes depleted of its nutrients, and therefore loses its fertility, which means that you cannot grow crops, right? And that means you have to let the forest regenerate. And that can take many, many years, depending on the type of forest. Typically, we're looking at more than 15 years of forest regeneration before a plot is going to be anywhere near productive again. To help reduce that damage to soil fertility and therefore prolong the life of your plot, you can plant different crops together with each other. And that's exactly what we find in Swidden agriculture. And that's part of the reason why fruit trees are planted along with grain crops. Plants like maize, cassava, grains, these need nitrogen, and they extract nitrogen from the soil, so they deplete the soil of nitrogen. Now, other plants, like legumes, for example, put nitrogen back into the soil, so you have that balance. If you plant fruit trees, right, you can also get some stability that provides shade, and it provides soil stability in terms of not just in terms of water runoff and erosion, but in terms of water storage for that plot of land. Different plants also have different phenology cycles. So one plant may be ripe in May, for example, asparagus, and your tomatoes may not be ripe until late summer, July or August, or whatever it happens to be. So you have some food that's going to be available throughout the year. You don't just have this one time where all the food is available. So you kind of stagger that, right, as much as possible. And multiple crops does something else. Having multiple species of plants growing together. Not only do you have different phenology, soil stability, but also having different crops means you reduce risks. Now, this can be in terms of pests or anything that might lead to crop failure. That could be a disaster if you only have one crop, a monocultural crop. For example, if you only have potatoes, which we talked about last week, and then there was some pest or a microbe or drought or whatever it happens to be that would cause that crop to fail, well, suddenly, under a monocultural crop, that's a disaster. You're in trouble. You may starve, your population, your family may starve, right? But if you have multiple crops growing together and one fails for whatever reason that is, right, you still have others that you can hopefully rely on or fall back on. One of the problems with this type of agriculture is that in this particular day and age, it causes a lot of damage. Now, what you're looking at on this screen are a few photos of the forests in Sumatra and Borneo, and as well the photo on, I think it would be your right-hand side, along the Amazon. And you can see that those islands and a large part of the Amazon rainforest is on fire. And those are not natural fires. Those are human-made fires specifically related to slash and burn agriculture. Yes, when you combine those natural fires that do exist with slash and burn agriculture, you have a critical situation. And I don't just mean for the forest or for the wildlife in that forest, but for entire ecosystems of which we are a part. If you have a large population, then this subsistence agricultural technique is no longer sustainable, because you simply do not have enough forest and it cannot regenerate fast enough. Because once you exhaust an area of its nutrients, you have to, by definition, move to a different plot, right? To a regenerated or pristine forest to start the process again, because you need a plot of land that has regenerated, right? Otherwise you don't get the fertile ash, and your crops will not grow or grow as well. Plus you expose that plot that you just cleared to erosion, and not a little bit of erosion, but we're talking about large-scale erosion, because we're talking about a plot of land in a rainforest or a forest in any sense, right? You have no trees, or you have very young trees, so you don't have those large roots, meaning there is very little storage of water beneath the surface, and that means that you increase runoff, and that means nutrients are washed away, which is also why you would need to move plots regularly. And this is why you need to allow regeneration, so the soil is fertile, right, and the soil is protected. And when you clear and burn the plot again, then you can get another nutrient-rich layer. It's a cycle. So in terms of smaller scale, smaller populations, Swidden agriculture does have some degree of sustainability, but it loses that once you're talking about large scale and large populations. Now this relates more to some of my other classes in which we look at aspects of ecosystem and primate conservation, but this is having tremendous impacts not just to ecosystems and primates or other wildlife, but to humans as well. Now we're talking about layers of potentially disastrous impacts as a result of large-scale Swidden agriculture. Now keep in mind that just because people are growing crops doesn't mean that people entirely subsist on the crops that they are growing. And this type of subsistence system is occurring in a particular area, right? It's occurring in the forest, and that means you are surrounded by a forest and forest resources. All of that makes sense. It's all common sense, right? The Swidden crops will provide dietary staples like carbohydrates to the diet, right? The base of the diet that we find in all populations. But the forest is also being used. Hunting, fishing, collecting, these are critical components of Swidden agriculture, and they provide those 500 million people with the protein and fat and other aspects of nutrients that they need to survive and grow and reproduce. As we are talking about generally particular areas, people in particular areas, in South and Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, parts of the Americas, such as South America, we're talking about areas that are also where we find the last remaining patches of rainforest. You know, the same areas where people are living and involved in Swidden agriculture. And that means we're talking about essentially islands of biodiversity for wildlife and for ecosystems. Okay, on to one of my favorite articles and one of my favorite authors, an article called The Power Steer by Michael Pollan, who is a professor in the School of Journalism at University of California, Berkeley, an author of many books. He's in our video documentary this week. Hopefully some of you have heard or read or seen a talk by Michael Pollan. And he put together this amazingly engaging piece on the production of beef in the United States. And it's still relevant today. I mean, it hasn't lost any of its relevancy. What he wanted to do was track the production of beef along the whole process, from insemination of a cow to you sitting down at a table with a steak or whatever it is on your plate. Let me preface this by saying that Michael Pollan is not saying that you should not eat meat or be a vegetarian or anything like that, and that's not what I'm saying either. Michael Pollan was and still is a meat eater, but there is something about the process that is disturbing to Michael, who is a nutritional journalist, basically, and disturbing to a lot of people. And it's enough to turn some people off of eating processed meats or meats that come from our industrialized processing plants. For me, this is one of the most interesting articles. There are several in the book that I love, and this is definitely among those top 10 for me. When I first read this book, it was one of the top 5 articles that really stuck with me the longest. Now, I'm not going to summarize all of the book chapters that you're going to read, and some of them I will give you additional information or a different perspective. Others I'll just challenge you to read those and bring your own summaries into our discussions and into the quizzes. But this is one of the chapters that I just can't help myself, because it's for me it was a really captivating article. So Michael bought himself a calf, and that calf spent the first 6 months of its life living alongside of its mother in a calf-cow operation. And it spent those first few months before being sent to a feedlot and then to a meat packing plant, doing what cows are adapted to do, to eating grass, various types of native grasses. However, eating grass and allowing livestock the time and the space that it requires for them to graze, for example, under the pastoral subsistence system, that takes time and space. Our fast food society does not like to waste time or space. I mean, 100 years ago, it would take between 5 and 6 years to raise a cattle until it had enough meat that you could slaughter it and sell the beef. Today, it takes 14 months. How do we reduce the time from 5 to 6 years down to a mere 14 months? Well, it's not by letting the animals, the cattle, do what they are adapted to do. It's not through just eating grass. And we also took a product, meat, something that was historically like a luxury item, a sort of a treat, and we've turned that into something that is a commonality. I mean, meat is everywhere. More than likely, if you eat meat, then you tend to eat meat every single day, and for some people, in every single meal. And think about that. You probably know somebody who doesn't think a meal is complete without meat. But back to Michael's story. 6 months down the road, and that 6-month-old calf was put on a truck and brought 500 miles down the road to a feedlot. And at the feedlot, the cattle, and they're not called calves anymore, even though they arrive at 6 months of age, and are only about 14 months of age when they're shipped off to the meatpacking plant. But now they're called cattle. They are fed Rumensin, which is an antibiotic, and a fairly powerful antibiotic. And they consume this every day with every single meal. And the question would be, why are they consuming this? Well, the calves are not actually that prone to getting naturally sick. I mean, they don't get sick this often in the wild when they eat grass. But if you take an animal, whether it's a cow or a human or whatever that happens to be, and you put them in a feedlot, for example, surrounded by thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of other cattle, and feeding all of them on one type of food, well, they tend to die. It kills them. So you want to slow that process of death down, basically, with antibiotics, keeping them alive just long enough that you can maximize growth with growth hormones historically, so you can maximize meat, essentially. And they get a lot of corn, like 25 pounds of it, with a little bit of hay and those antibiotics all mixed together. And what that translates to is about 3.5 pounds of weight, which is to say meat and fat, that they add to their bodies every day. That's a lot. But what about that corn? That corn doesn't come from nowhere. You need massive cornfields just to feed all of those cattle. And all those cornfields need to grow, right? That means fertilizer, chemicals, energy to grow and harvest that corn and then transport it as well. All those chemicals and fertilizers lead to nitrogen runoff, which creates massive dead zones, like, for example, along the Mississippi towards the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, for every bushel of corn going to a feedlot, we use about 1.2 gallons of oil, not including the oil and the energy to process and get that corn from the processing plant to the feedlot itself. But that's what they do. They eat. These cattle eat when they're at the feedlot. They eat and they defecate, and that's pretty much it. There's no access to fields because there's no space or time for that. There's no access to natural foods because there's no space or precedence for that. There's no demand for that from the consumer. They don't have access to a social system. Now, I study social animals, primates, non-human primates, but I would challenge you this coming weekend, for example, if you happen to have time to go outside of Eugene, maybe you're on a road trip, whatever, when you see some cattle, stop and observe them. Cows are social. Cattle are social. They have adapted to being social for millions of years, right? And suddenly being crammed into tight quarters and living in their own waste, that's a recipe for disease. The only thing that prevents that disease is antibiotics, and not just one type, but there's several different types. And of course, growth hormones in some cases, and that increases growth and suppresses the body's natural reactions under those conditions, which would be disease and death. Despite all of that, we still get marketing that corned beef or corn-fed beef is more healthy, and it's not, right? Corn-fed beef may have more marbled fat, which is fat between the muscles. And Americans, or people that live in the United States, more accurately, may have grown up with the taste of corn-fed beef. But corn-fed beef also has more saturated fats, which, as hopefully you remember, are not exactly good. And that's compared to the same animal under a natural diet, which also has fat, but tends to have more healthier fats and significantly less saturated fats. There are a number of health issues that we are facing in the United States, and many are related to diet. Just as cows or cattle are not adapted to eat corn, we are not adapted to eat cattle that eat corn. Now we have been eating meat, as you remember, for at least the last 2.5 million years as a more regular part of our diet, and probably as a frequent part of our diet for about the last 1.7 million years. In terms of all our domesticated animals, these are animals that eat grass and natural vegetation, right? We completely changed that food web and the microbes in these animals. And that means that it has an impact on us as well. If you feed corn to cattle, now they can digest that. Now it's not healthy, especially because it's just a monoculture. Corn is a starchy monoculture. Whether you're talking about cattle or goats or sheep, these are animals that need to burp because they have this buildup or production of gas in this complex multi-chambered stomach. But too much carbohydrates or too little fiber for these animals creates several problems. And most notably, you cannot burp anymore. As an ungulate, as a cattle, as a leaf-eating primate. And if you cannot burp, then the gas begins to build up and to build up in the stomach. Now this may sound unlikely to most of you. I know some of you know this. Some of you are also interested in health, interested in being a vet, or have working experience in relation to this. But it may sound unreal. However, bloat is a very real and frequent cause of death for cattle in a feedlot. The gas builds up to a point that it either suffocates the animal or the animal dies from dehydration, starvation, and pain because they cannot eat. Also, corn changes the pH levels in the stomach. The stomach for something like a cattle needs the natural pH levels are maintained due to the diet, and that's important to maintain the pH levels because they rely on a complexity of microbiota that has to survive in their bodies to help them to better digest and extract the nutrients from a grass-based diet. Once you change that diet to corn, you change the pH levels because there isn't enough fiber, and that causes the microbiota to die. And that would be lethal in a leaf-eating primate, for example. And it would be lethal in a cattle as well if it wasn't for the antibiotics that help to keep them alive for about 8 more months, because that's all it takes. Because their digestive systems, liver, heart, wouldn't actually be able to put up with that diet for much longer than that time. You don't have cattle that live on that diet for more than a year. They die between 9 months and a year on that diet. So you've got to keep them alive as long as possible to grow them as much as possible. And it's thanks in part to those antibiotics and to those growth hormones, which can contribute to infertility and reduced sperm count in human males and premature maturation in human females, as well as the many negative consequences that all of this has created on the environment. And that's not the end of the process, because the next step is the meat processing and packing plants. Meat packing plants like Monfort's, which some of you may know of. That's one of the biggest ones in our country, and it just so happens to be in Colorado, and it just so happens to be in a town where I partly grew up. So I have some some perspectives and experiences in terms of working at a meat packing plant. If you're interested in that for a final project topic, or you just want to rap with me about it, you'll have to swing by my office and we can talk. Anyway, back to Michael's story. On that day, Michael's calf, that was only 14 months old, was put on a truck, driven down the road to the meat packing plant along with 35 other calves, all of them weighing about 1,200 pounds, heavy with meat. And what goes on inside the killing field is something that's really only briefly touched on in the article. I am also going to briefly talk about this, but let me first say that I'm not trying to gross you out, and I'm not trying to make you upset or angry. I just want to briefly talk about this because we have this strange ability to ignore where our food comes from and how our food gets from field or animal to plate. So that killing process is designed to reduce stress that the animal feels, because a stressed animal at 1,200 pounds is difficult to handle, and a stressed animal releases hormones into its body, including into its muscles and fat, right? Adrenaline into its body, and that can make the meat taste very different. So you have this design to reduce stress, and then you have a steel bolt into the head of the calf, and the calf is hung by its feet, and the throat is cut to bleed it, and the skin is removed. Now, that bolt doesn't always kill the animal. In fact, there are many cases where an animal has actually woken up during the defleshing and bleeding part, which is why there are strict regulations on the killing floor. And that's thanks entirely to a fast food chain, McDonald's, who was wanting to prevent animals from leaving the killing floor alive. And they wanted that because they wanted consistency in the way that their meat tasted. Anyway, after the defleshing, you need to clean the animals, because remember, they have been living in their own feces, and with potentially hundreds or thousands of other animals for 6 to 8 months. And that means there is a very high risk of E. coli and other bacteria in the meat, unless you have a clean carcass. So those carcasses are sprayed with more antibiotics and more antimicrobials. What that means is that we dump a lot of money into removing bacteria rather than preventing it from happening in the first place. Hopefully you've read the article, and I'm really excited about our video documentary this week. Please make sure that you watch that documentary. It complements the chapter and therefore the lecture excellently. But in the end of all this process, most ranchers only earn about $3 per cattle. That's it in terms of profit. And think about that. A whole system that is not healthy to the environment, it's not healthy to the animals, it can even be not healthy for us, and yet we keep on doing it. We'll look at this again towards the end of the term, the idea of being a conscientious consumer, choosing meat that is hormone-free, that is antibiotic-free, meat that might be organic, natural, grass-fed. There is a lot of complexity to the issue, but it boils down to making an informed decision. All right, let's go ahead and stop there for this lecture, and whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and start the next lecture on materialist approaches. Again, just a review / preview for this week and next week. This week we have the 2 lectures, a number of readings, and our next quiz. Next week we have a few lectures, one on ideology, symbolism, power, and one on adapting people to foods and adapting foods to people. However, no assignment next week, so that's a benefit. Okay, we'll see you next week.